Welcome everyone to this talk this evening. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Jingjing Lo. She received her PhD from Indiana University at Bloomington in the field of international and comparative education studies. And she is currently chair and professor of education and youth studies at Firewall College in Wisconsin. Jingjing has been doing research on migrant and rural youth education in China since 2005, and she has also studied other topics such as the privatization of higher education in Russia and China, Sino-Africa higher education exchange programs, and education for sustainable development. Her current research project examines the impact of rapid product examines and examines the impact of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and internal migration on the lived experience and educational and professional aspirations of migrant and rural youth living in between the urban and the rural space in China. It's such an honor to welcome you, Jingjing.
Thank you, Sumbala, for your introduction. And thanks to Dr. Chai for your invitation to this webinar, and also Educators Without Borders for make this happen. I'm very honored to be here today to share my research about rural education and a little bit about migrant children education, which I've been doing in the past 20 years. So now I'm going to share my slides. Can somebody give me a heads up if you can see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, looks like it's good. Thank you. All right. Rural education obviously is a huge topic, right? And not to mention China is a huge country with a lot of differences and complexities. Doing a talk on rural education in China within 45 minutes is quite a daunting task, but I'm going to try my best by summarizing some of the major lessons, as well as discussing some of the challenges that China faces right now in this field, given today's time. In my talk today, I will giving 3 parts. First, of course, I would like to make a little bit introduction or overview, discussing education China as the overview, because I imagine some of the audience might not have much context. So I would like to discuss education China in a glance and why rural education matters. The second part is probably what perhaps most interesting to most of the audience. What are some of the lessons we can generate by studying rural education in China? To summarize, China made huge progress in the past decades, improving rural education specific and education in general. So what are some implications other countries might be able to borrow from? Lastly, in the remaining time, I would also like to discuss some of the current challenges that China faces in the field of rural education. What are some new problems and what are some of the possible directions China can deal with in the future? So this is the outline of my talk. A little bit of myself. So Bill already gave some professional introduction about myself. I would like to also offer a little bit personal introduction, specifically related to the question of why I study rural education. So I was actually born and raised in a rural village all the way till I was 11 years old, about 5th grade. My father was a teacher and principal in a rural school. So I had all the experience with rural education as a child. But then we moved to the city because my father got a promotion. And from there, I was able to access to some of the best education opportunity that city can offer. I went to some of the best university in China, where Professor Chai also went. We are alumni. And from there, I also got to study abroad in the United States. And here I am a professor here. But during my graduate school, that was in early 2000s, I went back to China to do some field work. And I was actually doing research about higher education. But then I got opportunity to went to Northwest China in Shanxi province. Some of you might know about the Terracotta Soldier, a famous archaeology site. So my fieldwork site was actually not far away from that. So because I am from East Coast, not far away from Shanghai. So the countryside I experienced as a child is very different from the countryside I observed in early 2000 in Northwest China, in some of the poorest provinces and poorest rural counties in China. So when I was looking at the rural children there, I couldn't help thinking about, what if I never left rural China, right? Or what if I was a rural girl in this rural county? So would I get all these opportunities to get this great educational resources, go to some of the best university and study abroad in the US? Probably not. I might be like one of them, right? Finished middle school and then went to work as a migrant worker in the city. Or even worse, I might drop out in the middle of it, in the middle of middle school or even primary school. So this really prompted me thinking about rural education and also the huge inequity across region and specifically between urban and rural China. And from there, I've been studying rural education for almost 2 decades. So before we start talking about rural education, as I mentioned, let's have an overview of education in China. So here is lots of statistics, right, generated by a report by Ministry of Education in China in 2020. So in reviewing education in China, we see a lot of achievement. For example, primary school net enrollment is almost 100%. And there's quite a bit of gender parity, meaning there's very little gender gap. Boys and girls receive equal opportunity to go to primary school. And enrollment rate of junior and high school, here we talk about gross enrollment rate, is 102.5%. Some of you may wonder why it's more than 100%. So in statistics, usually for enrollment rate, we look at the age cohort, but sometimes it's hard to analyze, calculate. So oftentimes people include everybody enrolled, and that includes those who are beyond the regular age cohort. They might be older because they delayed school or they come back after dropout. So that is why we have a more than 100% statistic there. But in general, if you look at this 9 years education, primary school, including lower level of secondary, this is a compulsory education level in China, we see a pretty universal access. Of course, not everybody made it to the end. If you look at the enrollment to graduation ratio at the compulsory education level, it's about 95% in 2019. That means about 5% of the people didn't make it through. And that is a story I'm going to tell later, like what happened to them. And most of them are rural children. And moving on, at the non-compulsory level, high school, including both academic high school, when children go to high school in order to go to colleges, and also vocational high school, when they receive some training in order to enter the job market. The percentage is also fairly high, over 90%, and majority of them go to academic high school. And the college enrollment is even more impressive, more than 50%. It's worth mentioning that in early 1990s, about 30 years ago, it was only 3%. So only 3% of age cohorts could go to universities, and 30 years later, with massive expansion of higher education and further marketization, over 50% of them could go to either junior colleges, which is 3 years, or a regular colleges, university, which is 4 years. As a comparison, India, the second populous country in the world, at about 27%, which is half of the China's enrollment rate. Japan is on par with China, about 58%, and United States has 88%. So that just gives you some overview of education in China. Lots of great statistics, lots of improvement. And wider education matters, as I probably already suggested in the previous slides. There is a divide between rural and urban education. That was actually not the case all the time in China. In traditional China, that we're talking about 19th century and before, there was quite an urban-rural continuum. And oftentimes literati scholars or government officials oftentimes chose to send their children back to rural China, where their roots are, to get educated. But then it no longer was the case, starting from 20th century with urbanization, industrialization, when cities became the places that people go for better educational opportunity as well as job opportunities. That actually had been the case globally. So China was not unique. But there is something unique. In 1950s, China established a so-called household registration system. It was actually modeled after the Soviet Union. And in Chinese, it's called hukou. What it means is there will be a rigid division between urban and rural residents. If you were born in the rural China, you have rural registration, and it was tied to specific social, welfare, healthcare, education, etc. And similarly, urban residents also receive different kind of benefits. And without doubts, you probably have guessed. So urban residents receive far better educational, healthcare, and also retirement welfare and benefits compared to the rural residents. So essentially, it's almost a domestic tracking system when rural and urban residents, they receive different benefits and also develop differently. From the statistics, we can also clearly see the official aggregated primary school dropout rate in China is only 0.2%, so almost negligible. But the cumulative dropout rate of rural students in less developed regions, such as Northwest China, where I studied, can be as high as 8.2%. In some of the studies, like in specific counties, the dropout rate can be a lot higher, such as 40%, which I'm going to talk about later. Another reason, scholarly speaking, to study rural education, because rural education does not limit in its own field. It actually intersects with a lot of other issues, for example, gender. Okay, girls' education is a huge topic for international development education. In rural China, because traditionally there's a favorism of sons, and that's specifically tied to agriculture, economy, and production. And that still has been the case in rural China. So there's a lot of preference to sons, and boys usually get better educational opportunity, or if the family had to choose to send only one kid to school, oftentimes it's a boy, not the girls. So I personally know at least two friends who are right now in the US. They both received PhD and very highly achieved in terms of education work, but their success is based on the sacrifice of their sisters at home. Their sisters drop out to support their education when the family could only afford one kid to proceed in schooling. Rural education also intersects with domestic migration issues. So you probably heard about the term of migrant children. In China, there are a lot of domestic migration. And that itself reflects about both urban-rural divide, because rural parents or rural farmers left for city to seek better educational opportunity, to work there, but they could not get the same benefits as their city residents because of the household registration system. They sometimes take their children along with them who receive less ideal education in the city, or most often they also choose to go to city by themselves, but leaving their children behind in the village, supervised by grandparents or relatives. And lastly, rural education also intersects with the issue of social class. With development of education and also economic in general in China, we see more and more social stratification. And that actually goes beyond the rural-urban dualism. We see different social class groups form both within the rural and urban, and also in the migrant children group. And I'm going to talk about in the last bit of the slides. Now we're moving on to the second chapter, or second parts of the talk, rural education in China. Let's look at its major achievements and lessons. China is very successful in its educational field, and there are a lot of achievements we can document. Due to limits of time today, I'm mostly going to look at its achievement in the area of education for all, or sometimes literacy for all movement, because this is closely tied to the global education for all movement. And it's also closely linked to the development of rural education, because rural education is one of the primary targets when China have campaigns for literacy and education for all. We will start with the initial literacy campaign from 1949 to 1970s. So when People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, it inherited a huge number of illiterate adults from the previous government. So the first round of literacy campaign primary target at this existing illiterates or existing literacy issues. And moving on from 1970s to late 1980s, the second literacy campaign primarily focusing on formalizing basic education as an effort to prevent new literacy, because you need to educate young people, right? Children and youth So by the time when they enter workforce, they are no longer illiterate. And thirdly, during the second literacy campaign, one of the milestone is the 1986 9-year compulsory education law, which was written into Constitution. So this is a very important law that really pushed China's universalization efforts for primary education. Lastly, starting from early 2000s, we see government's policy to provide free compulsory education. That's their efforts to reach the marginalized group, including rural children and also minority groups. So these are the four major achievements or major milestones that I will talk about in today's talk. And before we go into specific of policies and also models of literacy campaign, I want to ask the audience 2 quick questions. So what is the literacy rate in China today? Can you guess? And for comparison, what is the literacy rate in India, the second populous country in the world? I'm just going to pause a few seconds and feel free to type up in the chat or just shout out. And just to give you some baseline information, in 1949, when China was founded, People's Republic of China was founded, only 20% people were literate. And as a comparison, India, when it became independent from the British rule in 1947, the literate rate was only 12%. So I'm going to pause a few seconds just for you to think. All right, okay, let's review the answer. So in 2021, last year, so currently China's literacy rate is 97%. And among the young people, children and young people 15 to 24 years old group, it's 99%, so pretty much universal. And India's number was also pretty good, 74%, but we can clearly see there's quite a gap, about 20% between China and India. Both countries are the most populous country in the whole world. And we clearly see a gap there. And for reference, by 2019, around 86% of the world population aged 15 years and older had been able to read and write. So we can clearly see China is performing a lot better than the world average. And when we look at the statistics along the timeline, as we mentioned, in 1949, 80% people were illiterate, and this number was dropping consistently to 43% in 1959, only 10 years later, thanks to rounds of literacy campaign targeting at existing literacy. And this number keep reducing all the way to 2018 to 3%. And along this process, we also see the reducing or narrowing of gender gap in this process. As you probably would concluded, there are a lot more female illiterate compared to male literate. And that has been the case in many other countries as well. In 1982, the gender gap was reduced to 28%. It is a lot better than the beginning of the story, but it's still quite significant. 30 years later, in 2010, when this number was recorded again, there's only less than 6% of gender gap. And this gap was further reduced today. And if we only look at the primary schooling, the 6 years of primary school, the gender parity is pretty much achieved. The urban-rural gap or regional gap, however, although it narrows, but still largely remain. If you look at who are the remaining illiterate and where they are, not surprisingly, you find them in rural regions. Like 3/4 of the illiterate live in rural regions. And for a long time, 80% population was rural in China. And so if you do the calculation, that's still quite a significant number of people. Minority regions, oftentimes also rural, also has some of the highest numbers. Tibet, for example, its illiteracy rate is highest, 33% among all provinces, partially because the ethnic minority also have their own languages that kind of further complicate the issues of literacy campaign. As I briefly mentioned in one of the previous slides, China's literacy campaign coincides with the Global Education for All movement, or EFA movement. I know we have friends from Educators Without Borders. So as international organizations, you are very familiar with international policies such as this. But here I'm just gonna briefly mention some of the signature events. And clearly the Global Education for All movement officially started in 1948 with UN's Universal Declaration on Human Rights. When it specified everyone has a right to education, education should be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. And it also kind of promoted that elementary education shall be compulsory. So there are a lot of meetings afterwards, and specifically 1990s, we saw the World Declaration on Education for All, when more and more countries join each other to say education for all should be one of the policies many countries should be adopting. And in 2000, the World Education Forum in Dhaka, again organized by UN, and started developing 6 EFA goals, including reducing gender gap in education access, provide quality education, and also provide universal primary education. So it has goals, hopefully aim to be achieved by 2015. And we already know the story. It didn't happen in 2015. So a lot of countries made huge progress, but it was definitely not enough for the EFA goals. So 180 countries had to join each other in 2015 to remap the road to EFA and into the Global Education 2030. So now the goals have been rewritten, readjusted, and now we have a deadline 2030. So we have 8 years. So we're watching it closely. The United Nations actually published a global monitoring report every year. My advisor back in graduate school and myself actually contributed to one of the reports, global monitoring reports by UN in early 2000 about China. And this is actually what part of my talk is based on. So when we look at the Literacy for All campaign in China, as we talk about, which coinciding with the EFA movement globally, scholars have concluded, indeed, the literacy programs mounted in China after 1949 constitute what is perhaps the single greatest educational effort in human history. Just to cap it, it made huge progress, which is unimaginable for many countries. And that is why I put it here. Literacy for all campaigns in China itself is a model for borrowing by a lot of other countries that I would highly recommend. And specifically, there are 3 important elements in the literacy for all campaigns. The number 1, literacy education, adult education should be designed to eliminate existing illiteracy. Remember that China inherited a huge number of illiterate population from the previous government. So 80% of people were illiterate. That was a lot of illiteracy to deal with. So the first round of literacy campaign target at this group of people. And secondly, at the same time, we also need to look at the young people, right? Children, because children are best at learning. So if you give them opportunity to learn, they will become literate. So literacy education, universal primary education, or compulsory schooling need to take place, need to be structured in order to prevent new literacy. And that probably is most important because it can be done in a much structured way and sometimes written in the law. Lastly, this is actually something that many organizational governments actually tend to neglect or ignore. By turning illiterate people into literate, this is great, and that takes a lot of money, effort. But if you stop there when people graduate with the certificate that they're illiterate, you see job done, then you're going to run into trouble because oftentimes, especially for adults, even that they master those words and became literate. If you stop there and not providing them opportunity to keep learning and applying and using the newly acquired knowledge and literacy they have learned, they're going to forget about very quickly. And that's especially the case for adults and older people. But also including younger people. If they do not get a chance to use their learning, they also tend to forget it. So literacy education, post-literacy measures also need to be designed to sustain newly acquired literacy skill. And that is actually crucial for the success of literacy campaign in general. And specific, when we look at these 3 measures, right? When we look at the measures to design to target existing literacy, that was a priority for China for about 20-30 years. And we see, especially in the first 10 years, from 1949 to 1959, we see a lot of interesting measures. For example, there's even language reform, because traditionally Chinese characters were were quite complicated, and the government decided it might be too difficult for illiterate people to learn, so they actually simplified Chinese characters. And then there's also a lot of textbooks developed by local governments, not central government, actually local governments. And the textbooks oftentimes have very practical contents and related to the lives and works of local people. For example, it might be directly addressing knowledge of agriculture production. So the adults learning it, they feel they're learning something that can actually be useful, right? That they can use on their daily life. And government also categorized literacy criteria, because literacy, if you give one standard, it might be daunting for many. So they actually categorize literacy standards and for different group of people. For example, before you become literate, you could first become semi-literate. That's like if you master 500 characters. And also for people who have different jobs, like peasants versus workers versus, say, political cadre, they have different requirements. Like for peasants, adult peasants, if you master 1,500 words, you're considered literate. If you're workers, 2,000 words. But if you are political cadre or intellectuals, like people working in places that actually need you to know more reading and writing, and the standard has been up to 3,000. So that way, it kind of offers very achievable goals for different group of people based on their different career and also different age group. There are a lot of short-term classes offered in addition to regular schooling. And these classes are offered very flexible times, like from evening, weekends, or even during breaks from works. And this proved to be very successful. There's also a lot of community organizations and NGOs. To give an example, Women's Federation in China, that's a government coordinated non-for-profit organization. It has its branches in almost every level of Chinese administration, like from village all the way to the county, to the province, and also to national. So they play a huge role in mobilizing women in the literacy campaign. There's, of course, also governmental monetary incentive. There's both carrots and sticks. Carrots, there's a monetary incentive if you're very successful as a school or as a school district or as a village or county. There's incentive, like a budget allocation. But there's also sticks, carrot and sticks, right? If you fail to achieve certain goals, then some officials might be demoted or they might not get their promotion. So altogether, this really helped China eradicate most literacy and within 10 years. And this process keep going on. And as we talk about the preventing new illiteracy probably is the most important task. And especially since it's about educating young people. I'm going to talk more about that in the next few slides, specifically focusing on compulsory and free basic education. And lastly, we talk about it's important to design program in order to sustain newly acquired literacy skills. So adults who graduated and they got their literacy certificate, they don't stop there. Oftentimes the government would design program such as vocational training. It doesn't have to be years. Oftentimes it could be like 3 months or half a year, and come to learn how to fertilize your crops, come to learn how to grow specific crops in like high production. And then that way the adult newly becoming literate can use the skill they just learned, at the same time also learn something useful and help with agriculture production. And similarly, workers in the factory, they also receive similar programs in order to sustain their newly acquired literacy skills. We talk about preventing illiteracy is one of the most important measures, and that is primarily done by compulsory education. 1986, the compulsory education law was written into the Constitution that basically asked that every single child need to receive at least 9 years of education, including 6 years of primary school and 3 years of lower secondary. At the beginning of compulsory education is not free, was not free. Families had to share the cost. It was not a lot, usually 20, 30 Chinese yuan, translated into probably $3-4 US. but then it was still quite a burden for many of the rural families or some of the urban poor families. Because again, the farmers don't usually receive salary. They work on their, they make a living by their agriculture production, and that was not much. So that actually has affected enrollment and dropout rate quite a bit. And over the years, compulsory education was financed primarily by local governments. And that also means there's huge regional divides. East Coast, where I was from, traditionally are the most developed regions economically. So the local governments are wealthy. They were able to finance their compulsory education level a lot more. What does that mean is school usually have better facilities, and the school fees are actually a lot lower, and parents could afford more. So there's better development of compulsory education. But the Northwest China or the hinterland government was usually in a much worse budget situation. They did not have a lot of money to support education, and the family also couldn't afford to support their children's education. So we see huge regional divides. Regardless, the government have a lot of measures try to enforce compulsory education is done. It's enforced by families, schools, and local government together. And there's a huge accountability. For example, schools, if they have a lot of children drop out, then their principal will be questioned by the school district. Similarly, local government, when they report the number of dropout rates, if it's too high, again, the officials will be in trouble. And that actually offers a lot of incentives for families, parents, right, teachers, as well as government officials. So trying to retain every single child in the school and make sure they go through a compulsory education. And as mentioned, because compulsory education was financed by local governments, and it created huge regional divide and also issue of dropout for children who couldn't afford it. Since early 2000s, the government has been pushing for free education. Finally, compulsory education became free. So it made baby steps in early 2000s by offering free education to rural students only in some of the provinces that had most of budgeting issues. It waived the school fees, their book cost, and also offers subsidies for their boarding costs, because in rural regions, oftentimes there's only one school for like multiple villages, and children had to either board at school or travel a long way in order to go to school daily or weekly. As a result, this cost is extra because you have boarding cost and also food cost. The government will provide subsidies for these students to support that kind of expenses. In 2006, they were able to provide free education for all rural students. In 2008, finally, education is free for all children, regardless if they're from rural or urban regions. And in order to do so, they decided the money should come from the central government rather than the regional government. So central government collects tax money from different provinces, including the wealthy province and also the less wealthy province. So essentially, the wealthy province started subsidizing the less wealthy provinces. But the result is wonderful because the budget will be done on a per pupil base. So it doesn't matter if you're from Shanghai or you're from Tibet, every single child receives the same budget in order for their education to happen. And that is a measure to ensure equity. So when we summarize, like what are some of the effective policies, right? And we see the strong will of government also matters a lot, because that is how the government can are willing and also motivated to develop effective policies, leading to great success. Decades-long literacy campaigns, including free compulsory education policies, really helped China achieve the universalization of primary education and reduce urban-rural gap and gender inequity at the basic education level, at least. And the government demonstrates strong political will because it's a socialist country. So based on socialist ideology, education equity is one of its fundamental values and also the base of its rule. This is why it's important to provide good education to its citizens, doesn't matter where they're from. The government also has deep economic interest to improve its education. That is based on the human capital theory, right? Because China's economy is increasingly linked to the global economy. In order to compete with other economic entities, it needs great human powers, right? It needs human capital or labor force that has innovation, that can offer a lot of creativity in order for it to develop its economy and compete with other countries. In order to do so, it needs a solid education system. And the government realized it goes through mobilizing various organizations at the local levels for literacy campaigns, such as the Women's Federation. It targets adults as well as emphasizing children and youth by eradicating illiteracy, preventing illiteracy, but at the same time also sustaining literacy skills. The government also holds local governments and schools accountable for pupil enrollment and retention. And lastly, it finances compulsory education through central government to reduce regional inequity. So these are some of the lessons that we can learn from China's achievement, specifically to education for all and rural education. But now we're moving on to the third and also last part of this talk. What are some of the current challenges that China faces, especially in the field of rural education? When school access is no longer an issue, the schooling process becomes a prominent problem. We see unequal learning during the schooling process, which I'm gonna document later. And specifically, there are two challenges. With universal primary education and free compulsory education achieved and enforced, why rural students still drop out of school? And why are rural students still left behind, right? We're talking about both access. We talk about national statistics is about 8% of the rural children drop out compared to the national average of 0.2%. And rural students also perform far lower compared to their urban counterparts. So it's not just about going to school, it's also about what they can achieve through schooling. The second challenge is, what does rural education in China looking like right now with China's rapid urbanization, mass domestic migration? So at one point of the slide, I mentioned China was a largely had a largely agriculture population for a long time. 80% of the population was agriculture for quite a few decades, but things had changed starting from 1980s with rapid urbanization. Now China has more urban population than rural. So what does that mean for rural education? When we look at the first challenge, specifically the dropout and retention issue, as we discussed, right? So the official dropout rate was fairly low, but in real situations, some of the rural counties might have very, very high dropout rate. And why? This is actually exactly what my research was about in the first decade when I was studying rural education. I studied why there was still such a high dropout rate among rural population. And for that, we had to kind of go a little bit deeper in the study of schooling. Sociologists of education use a term called the black box of schooling, because when we look at education, right, oftentimes we look at the input, right? Okay, if we want to improve education, pump more resources into it, right? More money, better facilities, and also quality teachers. That's what we talk about education input, right? And that is also oftentimes we see statistics like student enrollment rate, and also teachers, educational level, etc. And then oftentimes people also look at educational outputs. So we pump so many resources here. We have children starting and being enrolled here. What's going to happen afterwards? We look at education outputs. What's the graduation rate of students, right? What's their academic performance? And also other development, the products of education, that's what we call output. But oftentimes there's little attention paid to the educational experience. That's the process of schooling. And that is related to the students' classroom experience, teaching pedagogy, what they're learning, how they are being taught, teacher-student interaction, extracurriculum, etc. So this is actually things that oftentimes a lot of the government as well NGO oftentimes fail to touch because they struggle with increasing input, and hopefully that will increase output as well. But that's not necessarily the case. You have to really study closely the black box of schooling in order for this input to be turned into quality outputs. So my studies, which was done about 10, 15 years ago in Northwest rural China, look at children's life. I asked them to take pictures of their home, school, and also their observation of their surrounding society. There are a lot of great pictures and also great conversation happen between me and the children when we look at these pictures. So obviously, for many rural children, they still want to go to school and receive a good education because as this picture suggested, school is a ticket to board down a train to city. Like this kid discussed, right? She hoped to achieve a city life, a career in city, and also success through better education. And because that's the only way she could go to the city in a legitimate way. They also have sensed there's a lot of hope that pinned on them from their family who were living in a less ideal economic tradition, like this grandpa holding a granddaughter, right? And a rural student took this picture and feeling this grandpa is pinning the hope on this little child. So her education and her accomplishments, right, professionally, were eventually able to lift the family out of poverty. And that is why rural children have every incentive to study and in order to be successful through education. At the same time, there's also a lot of children who drop out during the process. Why? Here's a simple math problem. We talk about compulsory education, right? And finally, it was free now. It's free now. But high school is not compulsory and not free. In order to get a good career, you need to get a college education. In order to get a college education, to get into good high school. And the costs add up because the good schools are not cheap and good colleges can be expensive. And there's also loss of time during the process because when you're studying 3 years high school plus 4 years of colleges add up to 7 years, right? And after you graduate from college, however, the job market for college graduates used to be pretty great when there were only 3% of people can get a college education back in the 1990s. If you got a college degree, you got a good job, you got a great financial outlook. But now, with 54% of people getting a college education, the job market of college was no longer as clear. So that's a lot of money in terms of investment and also time as investment. That's your sunk cost, opportunity cost. But if they drop out or if they go to work right after middle school as a migrant working in the city, they can immediately bring income back to their family. And this 7 years, right, they could earn equal or even more money compared to if they continue their education. For those students who were doing very well in school and see a great outlook for them in college, this option is not tempting. But for those children who will struggle academically or financially, that's the case when they lost a parent, for example, or there's some major illness in the family. And this option became very tempting. And did I also mention the schooling process itself is also quite troubling for many students. Starting from 2010, China enforced a new curriculum in order to educate the future generation of labor force that comes with a lot more innovation and creativity, meaning the education right now is less focusing on memorization and rote learning, but it's more quality oriented. So it has a lot of interdisciplinarity and it requires teachers far more skills in order to educate the specific kind of products that this curriculum is asking for. But rural areas oftentimes does not have a lot of resources, right, to support that kind of education. There's also very little professional development for rural teachers in order for them to understand how to do this kind of education, which is far more demanding than just teaching rote learning and memorization. And rural students also having increasing difficulties in exam in specific and in school in general due to the urban center curriculum, because the quality early education oftentimes has a lot of assumption about children's surroundings. So the curriculum itself was written by the elites in the cities. So they reference to city life, reference to urban lifestyle, and that is very much distanced and detached from the rural life. So children either found it's not relevant to their life, specific English classes, or they found there's no interest. There's nothing to do with their life. And with this kind of quality education, that also fundamentally changed the performance of rural children. So decades ago, rural children, like even that they do not have a lot of resources, but if they have hard discipline. So rural children are known for being able to endure hardship or endure bitterness, eat bitterness, endure hardship. So they will work long hours. When city children went to bed after 10 o'clock, they continue studying all the way to midnight or even longer. And they are not afraid of rote learning and memorization, because that's actually what they're good at, because discipline can pay off by doing that. But now the curriculum is far more nimble, flexible, and requires a specific kind of knowledge horizon and life experience. And they found that whatever much efforts they put in, however much effort they put in, and however long time they dedicated to studying, they still are left behind because they just couldn't get it, because the knowledge itself is not built in their surroundings. This is how the new curriculum and education system reinforce and reproduce the socioeconomic gaps between urban and rural China. In the 1980s, rural children can still went to some of the best universities in China. And when you walk into a classroom in Beijing University or Tsinghua University, China's Harvard and MIT, you can still see a third or something, half the children came from rural China. But now this percentage is significantly lower, less than 10%, even little in some of the more elite colleges. And next is rural-urban dualism is also manifested in the design of the curriculum. Rural children oftentimes receive a lot of images and discussion about portraying rural China as being inferior and backward, and city as modern developed. This has inferior consequences for their development of identities. Rural children grew up actually hating where they are from, and they want to just leave for city for better life. But during the same time, they also find themselves kind of stuck in between. They're not really urban, but they cannot go back to their rural life either. I know my time is running to the end. I want to quickly show some of the slides. So this is the school that I did research in Northwest China, in one of the poorest provinces, and very mountainous regions. If you look at Chinese map, it's somewhere right here. I want to quickly go through the second challenge. That is rural children, they were no longer fixed in one place. During the rapid urbanization period, where is home for rural and migrant children? That's oftentimes in between rather than in one place. So China went through rapid urbanization from 1980s all the way to today. As I talk about, 80% population was rural in 1980, and now only 36% of the population is rural. So the rural China was really shrinking. At the same time, a lot of the rural population was also floating because they left village for city to seek better work life or sometimes education opportunity. According to the most recent census in 2020, about 1/4 of the total population is so-called floating or migrant population, and that is 376 million. And that domestic migration affected more than 1/3 of the total children, because they're either left behind in the villages by their parents who left for city, or migrate to the city with their parents. They receive less ideal education in the city compared to their urban counterparts. So the assumption embedded in many literature when they talk about rural education is there's a rural China, there's an urban China, there's some sort of migrant population moving between. And for rural China, their job is try to catch up with urban education. There's a gap in between. So that was kind of the assumption in many literature, and also in many of the international development education work. But in reality, in the Chinese case, what really happened is there are a lot of overlaps and interloops. So for rural children, some of them are left behind by their parents from the city. Some of them actually are returning from the city, meaning they went to the city with their parents, became migrants, but because they couldn't receive very good education because all the limits posed on migrant worker due to household registration system, they had to return to the village to receive high school education. So they are in the village, but they already had some urban experience. So as you can see, there's far more complicated cases, and that need to be taken care of when you study rural education. So again, I use photo voice methods, and this migrant worker kid or a migrant child took a picture of an apartment his relative bought in the suburb of the city, and talk about the countryside is being engulfed in the sprawling city. just like my hometown. One day my village will probably be completely gone, but I still would like to go back to it. So he captured the moment of urbanization ongoing in the progress, but he was also talking about his rural village back home, which is going through the same urbanization process. So this is the school that I studied in East Coast China in the past 10 years in order to document some of the recent challenges of rural and migrant children. As you can clearly see, that that's a rural school and also migrant children's school located in a rural part of the like not too far away from the city. And you can see the farmland was being turned into high-rise buildings. Again, that's a moment of urbanization ongoing in China right at the moment. So this is where I did my research in the past 10 years, close to Shanghai. So the fundings is teachers, we talk about quality-oriented education, right? So back in the early 2000s, so most of the discussion was still, yeah, we couldn't do in rural China, but the blame should be put on the government because government didn't provide enough training and government did not provide enough resources. And that is why the rural children did not succeed. But right now, the kind of ideas has changed. If you look at teachers' narrative, like this teacher, the science teacher, interview her why her students were less successful. She talked about, I too would love and have tried to add more hands-on activity to make it more relevant and relatable to their life in order for them to have better learning experience and success. But it just didn't work because my students have no 拓展能力 in Chinese. Engage specific means ability to extend and expand knowledge. I think it's because of the way they are brought up. For example, many urban families or even our local families, when their kids were younger and when parents took them out to play, their kids see a flower and the parents will start explaining what they know about flowers to teach the kid. This is what I mean by extension expansion ability. This helps students to connect the dots into lines and draw connections to what they learn. But these kids grew up very differently. Their parents do not have such knowledge or skills to do so, nor do they have time. So she was referring to the city kids, like in this picture, right? Their parents were able to support them with extra curriculum. This is a picture of parents waiting in a room for when their kids were receiving extra like tutoring for math, Chinese, English, etc. And even within the migrant children group, some of the wealthier migrant children who are shop owners, for example, right? They were able to support their children with piano lesson, calligraphy lessons, while the migrant workers who are construction workers or restaurant waiters, they couldn't support their children with this kind of resources. So the finding from the recent studies show that in teachers' eyes, certain human quality, in Chinese we call it 素质, for success in academic studies is constructed as absent, missing, and lacking from the beginning for rural and migrant children due to parenting and upbringing. Therefore, it's difficult for them to conduct quality-oriented education in classroom. For teachers, such quality cultivation should be mostly done by families, not by school. Parents' role mostly is lacking the migrant and rural children. School, therefore, they're less successful, but teachers do not see their role in improving this. So what is really the change, right? 15 years or the current challenges? Teachers, those human quality, as I mentioned, right, such as expansion and comprehensive capability, is important for students if they would like to succeed in studies and testing with a final goal of entering university and get middle-class job in cities. But these are constructed as missing from both rural and migrant children. Instead, they were constructed as having certain qualities, but tied to working class jobs, such as being handy, the willingness to endure hardship. So we can clearly see social stratification is going on in this case. So as a summary, right, when we look at China's success, right, in terms of improving access for its children, especially rural children, we also see its struggles, right, in providing equal learning experience for children from the marginalized group, including both rural and migrant children. China did make huge progress in the past 7 decades in eradicating illiteracy, universalizing primary education, reducing gender gaps in education access, increasing rural children access to schooling, and improving its citizens' overall education levels. Both the scale and the speed of such progress is extremely impressive and is one of the reasons behind China's economic success in the past decades. However, in the current situations, rural and migrant children while mostly having caught up with their urban counterparts in terms of access to schooling, are left further behind in the neoliberal economy and education due to unequal learning during the schooling process, including, for example, curriculum, right? And also the pedagogy. With the burden of quality education shifting from the government to families, schooling now contributes to the further social stratification of Chinese society based on the intersectionality of both regional differences and class divides. This is a great challenge to many capitalist economies that China will also have to address now. So here I conclude my talk. I'm a little bit over the time. Sorry about that. And thank you for your attention. And again, special thanks to Professor Chai and Educators Without Borders for inviting me. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask any now, or you can email me.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to either write them in the chat box, or you can come off mute and ask them. I'll just give a few moments here for any questions.
I see a question in the chat already. So Ahmed Fadi, right? Is I pronounce your name correct?
Yes, from Ahmed.
How did China overcome the problem of long commuting between home and school? That's a great question. Yeah, this is actually quite a unique question to rural education, as I mentioned, right? So village schools actually is not less a problem, because usually there's a school within the village, right? At the primary level, and children can usually just walk to school. But junior high or middle school is where the issue is. In order to consolidate resources, right? Oftentimes, like one county or one township have one middle school. That means children located in different villages had to travel there, right? And that created a lot of issues, both safety and also cost. Or sometimes it's just straight impossible to commute on a daily basis. Like the Northwestern province that I studied, I actually went to one of the children's home during one of the holiday, and she lived closest to the school, and it took 50 minutes in walking to get to her house. So she's commuting every day, but majority of the children, they had to board. So what happened is the school will usually have some facility like dormitory, and then they will rent it to children really cheap or free, but it's not enough. So a lot of children had to rent local farmers a room, like one room or sometimes half room, a bed, in order to board at school, so they could, get regular education and go back home only at most once a week, sometimes like once a month. So that created a lot of challenges, right? And so government has been dealing with it by directly addressing the cost. I think I briefly mentioned like the free education movement, right, in early 2000. It's not just about waiving the tuition or the book expenses. There's actually a lot of the budget dedicated to subsidizing this kind of boarding cost. And it's unfortunately not for everybody, but those rural children who had difficulties often will get monthly stipend in order for them to rent a room close to college, close to the school, and also pay for their daily meals. That is actually crucial, because as you already probably noticed, if they do commute, even like it's possible, that create a lot of the risks. Like girls oftentimes might encounter some sexual violence, and there's also direct safety issues, because a lot of children live in mountainous regions. So if you walk the mountainous path, and when it's dark, that creates direct physical danger to the children. So I hope that answers your question, Ahmad. I see another question from Ines or Ines. I'm sorry.
Yes, dear, Ines.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, does the local limitations that Chinese made for universal platforms like Facebook, etc., affect the growth mindset of students? That's a good question. So you're talking about the Great Firewall of China, right?
Yes, dear. I have 2 students Chinese in my classroom, and when they come to Dubai, they always tell me, Miss, we love the flight to Dubai, because once we are on the flight, we can talk to our friends, we can have other platforms and chat and exchange. And I'm telling them that's very good that your country is preserving a very specific routes of connections. And my question is not about the growth mindset. It's typically about the personality of the students receiving such limitation in the world, in a worldwide exposure to everything and anything. Does this affect positively?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally do not do research on that. However, I can probably provide some information because I read, actually there's some other scholars who did research about that, right? They're kind of looking at kind of media censorship and specifically the Great Firewall of China, right? And how does that have impact on the young generation, right? And for those of you who do not know, the Great Firewall of China referring to basically media censorship. So certain websites like Facebook or even some news media like New York Times, right? You cannot access in China. I think Twitter, YouTube, all those, right? But China has a lot of equivalent to YouTube, equivalent to Facebook. Like that was popular in mainland China. Basically, domestically, people have no problem, right? Communicating and keeping touch with each other. It's about receiving information sources, right, from the outside world. So one is like for intellectuals, for young students, if they are determined to get information resources from outside, there's always a way. It's called VPN, right? Virtual Private Network, and that's what it's for, right? So like when I was in college, there's basically in the college, people will share information about VPN. You can use it to access to these websites. It also becomes more difficult lately. The government started cracking down VPN, but it's still possible. Like I have friends who had to go to China to do work and they need to access to this website. So they found a way. So for people who are determined to receive this information, they found a way. So that's one, right? For those who don't care or don't know the way, they have no access to these resources, right? So there's actually some scholars. There's a group of scholars, both domestic scholars from China and also some scholars from United States. They did some experiment. What they did is they allowed some college students in China to have access, right, to outside information, and just kind of they follow them for a certain period of time and see how they're going to change their mindset. So what they found is in the beginning, actually, even the young people not have access to all these resources, right? They actually did not change the way of their internet browsing. They just stick to the existing social media in China because they found, because if they don't have friends on Facebook, right, what's the point, right? So they basically maintain their current routine. They do not use it enough, right? So that is interesting. Basically, the young people's mindset and also the behavior has been shaped, as you talk about. But then the scholars push them, right? Kind of enforce, you need to use this website. You need to browsing it. So after browsing for a while, and we found that the young people's mindset does change. They feel like if they were more very patriotic before that, afterward, they still kind of question government. But at the same time, the scholars also noticed, they also kind of compare the resources. I can speak personally from somebody who kind of navigating between these two cultures, right? So when you are back home, you see a lot of pro-government propaganda, and if you talk about US, right, it's all bad things. But then when you were in the US, it's the opposite. If anything about China is bad. So you see kind of two extremes. So I think for people like myself, I think we were able to find the beauty of like having access to both resources, because then you can find some balance in between, right? I think the young people at the beginning stage, like they did not change the behavior, and then they started to question government. But the experiment is not long enough for them to reach the third stage when they can have critical thinking about media resources of both sides. So that's kind of like my sharing of both reading this report and also my personal experience about how we read the kind of change to the mindset. It's less related to the rural education, but I understand this question is important for us to understand Chinese education in general.
Thank you, dear.
What is the role? Yeah, there's
another question. Yes, you have another question. What is the role?
What is the role of NGOs in developing education in rural China? Oh, that's also a great question. Huge. But to understand NGO, we also need to look at critically. Okay, so I actually did a report just a few years ago with Beijing University. We actually wrote developed a blue book, right, looking at all the educational NGOs in China. And what they have been doing, and what are some success, what are some issues. So I feel I'm in a very good position to answer that question. So there are two levels of educational NGO. One is what I say the government organized NGO, non-for-profit organization, what we call Ngo, like a women's federation. So these are oftentimes basically supported and staffed by the government, but they also raise funding, right, through a lot of efforts and try to support grassroots initiatives like girls' education. There's also a lot of organizations that were grassroots, basically funded by individual or sometimes college students, and they all have this desire to help, to support, right, children that in a very marginalized or disadvantaged position. So it's kind of all over the places. The government one, we can see there's a clear agenda, right? It's closely tied to the government goals. For example, literacy movement, gender equity. Okay, we are on it because the government goals is there. So the government organized NGO will be focusing on these issues. The smaller NGOs, depending on their funding and also who funded it, they all pick a different niche. Like I talk about migrant children, right? Also left behind children, right? Those children who have parents working in the city and they were left behind, either supervised by grandparents who are mostly illiterate or relatives who basically don't really have much time for them. So there's one small NGO found about these issues. They were started doing some program, right? Sending college students there, offer companionship for the rural behind children in the rural. So basically offer them support, like a big brother, big sister, for them to have healthy psychological development. And similarly, migrant children in the city, actually a close friend of mine who just received her PhD from Harvard University and returned to China. So she actually founded an NGO in high school with her classmates, supporting migrant children development in the city of Guangzhou, which is close to Hong Kong. So they will organize, for example, like a summer camps for them, reading programs with them, and also like career exploration program for them. There's also a lot more NGOs focusing on like supporting like almost like remedial education for rural students, college students, or sometimes young professionals who had a gap year to spare. They will go to the rural China and teach English, teach anything that the school might need to the rural children. I personally was involved with the organization. They will go to rural China. They have field sites in different provinces, and then spend the summer with the children and develop reading programs because they feel the formal education is very limiting, and these rural children, their knowledge horizon need to be expanded, and reading can help them. So the organization help build the library, like buy books for them, but also organizing reading program to train the teachers and also do activity with the students. So there are a lot of NGOs. They're kind of all filling in different niches, which is great because the government has left a lot of loopholes, right? But the NGOs, they see this loophole, they started filling in. What I'm very happy to see is they're not only focusing on the access issues. So at the beginning of NGO, if you look at the 1980s, right, there's a huge government-sponsored NGO project called Hope Project, meaning like how can we support the rural children to get education? I talk about compulsory education. It was compulsory but not free. A lot of rural children have issues. So like the families in the cities or whichever family have more financial resources, they would donate to the program, right, to support those children who would otherwise drop out to go back to school. So that's for access. But right now, what we are seeing, the kind of donation to help with access still is going on. That is for people who are too busy with their life. Like they want to help, but they don't have time to actually work with the children. So they just donate. And I was in that camp as well sometimes. But then there's also other people, they see it's not just about access, it's about schooling experience, as I explained in the last few slides. So they started offering companionship, quality teaching, right? Reading, or sometimes there's even NGO offering liberal arts training for rural children. And these NGOs oftentimes were founded by college students or young professionals, and some of them were founded by overseas Chinese, overseas like American. There's a Teach for China program was actually founded by a Princeton graduate, kind of model this Teach for China or Beautiful China, maybe 中国 model up the Teach for America program. So there's a lot of the activities, but there's also some chaos. I talk about the report I did, right? Because they're also small. The sustainability is the issue because sometimes there's a founder who are very dedicated, but when the founder left, the NGO might just go away. Or sometimes you have really capable professional in charge of business for a few years, but then the person had to go back to full-time work. And then you got another people leading the organization and might go to different organizations. So it's really like all over the places. They're helping, but only some of them were able to provide constant, steady, and substantial impact on the marginalized kids' life. So if I were to summarize this, there are some international NGOs, although they are more limited due to the political climate in China. They're still there, but some of them were actually pushed outside, like Oxfam, I think the British one. Plan International, a British organization, was still there. UNESCO is always there, but some of the organization will be questioned more than others due to the political interest tied to the specific organization, if I may answer it that way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. A great question from Ahmed. I also had the same question, so really good to hear your opinion on that. I have one question to ask that has come separately, and that is, what is the role international NGOs like Educators Without Borders, the organizer of this event, can play to improve conditions of educators and education in rural China?
Okay, well, it's great to hear Educators Without Borders have interest in working in rural China, right? I kind of already pointed out some of the areas organizations like Educators Without Borders can work on, right? I do feel access remain to be an issue for a small group of children, rural or in minorities or in remote regions. They still need help. Like even there's free education, but because I go to rural China all the time, like oftentimes when we're interviewing students, we oftentimes review stories about the girl was doing excellent in school, right? Middle school, high school, but then, for example, father died due to accident in the city, in the construction work site where he worked. And then the family lost the labor, primary labor. And the mom was a farmer, but the farm was only a small patch of land, only enough for them to eat, but not enough to support the economic, the education of the kids. So the family I just mentioned, the girl was doing very successful in the school. So the family feels she should not give up. It's actually her younger brother at primary school, 5th grade, dropped out, went to work in the city to support his sister. That itself kind of talk about the reduction of gender gap. Like now it's about who has more likelihood to be successful in education, then the family is going to support them, right? Rather than just, okay, you're a boy, we're going to support you regardless, and you're a girl, you go work as a migrant worker, support your brother. So it's not always the case. So like in this specific case, I actually brought somebody with me when we were interviewing, and then during one of the volunteer activity, and the person who was with me eventually decided to sponsor the girl, and then she was able to continue education, and her brother hopefully could return to the family and also continue his education. So I still continue to see cases like that, like here and there, oftentimes in the less developed regions. Although in the developed region, the East Coast and South, it's less likely. But there's still need for financial support. But more so, as I talk about, right, I think the needs is to develop like rural children more holistic in a way, so they can have quality learning experience or equal learning experience as their urban counterparts. I talk about one NGO that's actually founded by an overseas like Chinese student, returned to China. He liked the idea of liberal arts education. I teach in a liberal arts college. I personally also embracing this kind of education. And the founder of the organization saw, oh, liberal arts is really great. I think we should also allow rural children to have this kind of exposure. So he brought this model, right, and then started sending college college students as volunteers to support rural children's development. Like we do not see them as only having very limited needs, like just getting to school, study. We should see them as individual has a lot of potential, right, to flourishing like a tree, just like urban kids. If we can provide them the kind of sunshine, water, and rich soil for them to grow into that kind of well-rounded person. So that's one organization. And then also companionship, I talk about, right? So a lot of children in rural China, they grew up without supervisors, proper supervisors, meaning their parents, right? So there's a lot of lacking of emotional support. And it's actually quite heartbroken. Like when I was studying early 2000 in Northwest China, when I made friends with the rural students. I remember one night, it's almost graduation time. I was sitting down with the one girl in the school playground, and then we were just watching the beautiful moon. And then suddenly she opened to me, and she said, like sister. She called me sister. She said, like sometimes I couldn't help wondering. Like her parents were migrant work. My parents left for city to work. They always say they're doing it for me, but I wonder if they are really for me or they're really for the money. Like every time when I thought about it, I just want to kill myself because I feel I shouldn't. But she just couldn't help wondering about that. So that's kind of speak about the emotional struggle these children are going through. Their family sacrificed a lot in order for them to have the financial resources to have education, but they lamented about the loss of, this emotional support, and also questioned the materialistic nature of this kind of capitalist economy. And these children actually have a lot of the issues, psychologically speaking. So there's a need of a lot of organization to kind of support that. And there's also other areas. If you're interested, we can have a private conversation. I can give you a long list. I hope they answer your question partially.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really wonderful answer to the question, and hopefully we'll be able to do much more for the mental well-being of these children as well in the future. I will probably guide us to wrap up now. We've gone a little bit over time, so
sorry about that. I spoke too long.
No, it was fascinating. It was really a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you so very much to you and to also Education Without Borders, of course, for organizing, bringing everyone together on this webinar and really making this possible. So special thanks to Education Without Borders, Dr. Xiaojin Chai, of course, and yes, to you, Dr. Jingjing, for doing this wonderful presentation. So if you have any final words to say, I think we can wrap up here.
I just want to thank you for the wonderful questions, and of course for this amazing opportunity to share my research. I always love to share my research. I feel rural education in China, there's a lot of great lessons achievement should not just be specific reserved for China itself, that can be shared with the world. There's some quite amazing achievement as well as struggles. I think other countries might also be seeing at the same time. So thanks again to Educators Without Borders and to Dr. Chai and to Sumbella for together make this happen. Of course, to our interpreters. I know I spoke pretty fast, so if you have any questions, feel free to email me.
Thank you so much. Maybe, any questions, maybe you could leave your email in the chat box or your contact details for everyone. And I think maybe one of the hosts now can stop the recording and save and end the call. So I'm not the host, so I can't do it myself.